Hey guys, tonight we step softly into a palace where silence weighs more than stone. Lanterns glow faintly, their halos stretching into long ribbons across polished tiles. The carved beams above bend, as if they're leaning in, curious about what we're about to uncover. And yes, if you think you'll survive the silence of these halls, you might want to reconsider. Silence here is never empty. It has a heartbeat. Do you dare find out what it's hiding? So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're settling in, share your location and the time where you're listening. Midnight in New York? Early morning in Sydney? Maybe a slow evening in Buenos Aires? Together, we make a constellation of small lanterns across the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The palace was more than walls and courtyards. It was a living script written in gestures. Generals had armies, but inside here, power rested on smaller things. Who lifted a cup first? Who sat a step closer? Who delayed a greeting by a heartbeat? Think of it like ancient social media, except instead of posting a status, you tilted your fan just slightly, and the likes were measured in how many courtiers repeated the gesture later that day. And at the center of this theater were the Empresses. They wore crowns heavy with jewels, but heavier still with expectation. Some were celebrated with music and silk, others erased with phrases like a sudden illness or an unfortunate exhaustion. Words neat enough to tie up a record, but too neat to explain why rumors lasted longer than incense smoke. Imagine a feast, trays heavy with delicacies, musicians plucking endless melodies. At first glance, harmony. Yet one goblet remains untouched. A servant's hand trembles. A smile lingers a moment too long. In these subtleties, entire futures could turn. To us, it's background noise. To the palace, it's breaking news. And so we begin with the whispers of vanished Empresses women who stepped through the gates with dreams of harmony, only to discover the palace had dreams of its own. The question is, what happened to those dreams once the doors closed behind them? The girl chosen for the throne, her story, often begins long before she sets foot inside the palace gates. You can picture her in a courtyard far from the capital, where the sound of wind in bamboo is louder than gossip, and the sky is wide enough to make dreams feel safe. She is young, perhaps still practicing how to sit for long ceremonies without shifting, still adjusting her laughter so that it sounds delicate, not careless. Her family knows that every smile, every bow, every recitation of a poem could place her on a path toward power. They dress her in silk that glows under lamplight, teach her how to answer questions without truly revealing anything, how to walk slowly enough to suggest grace but not arrogance. In some ways, she is a performer, rehearsing endlessly for a role whose script she has not yet seen. You and I can imagine what it felt like when the letter or summons arrived. Her name selected, her fate sealed. The villagers might have congratulated her family, comparing it to winning the ancient lottery of destiny. In today's terms, it's as if her profile had suddenly gone viral without her consent, everyone talking about her new role, but no one asking if she was ready to live in that spotlight. As she approaches the capital, the roads grow wider, the walls taller, the rules sharper. Guards in crimson armor line the pathways. Eunuchs carry scrolls that dictate who may pass and who must wait. The girl sees the palace for the first time, its roofs layered like mountains of jade, its walls painted vermilion, its sheer scale reducing her footsteps to the size of whispers. Stepping inside is like crossing into another world. The scents change. No longer the simple smoke of village kitchens, but thick coils of incense that cling to the skin. The colors shift too. Gold in every corner, dragon and phoenix motifs glaring down as if judging her worth. She is not simply walking into a building. She is entering a machine of ritual that will press her into shape. Her tutors remind her to bow at exact angles, to memorize the names of ancestors carved on tablets, to recite blessings, as though her voice itself carried fortune. She is told that her silence must be eloquent, that her glances must never betray impatience. Think of it as ancient etiquette training that would put even a modern influencer bootcamp to shame. Because here, one misplaced gesture is not just a bad post. It could shift alliances. And then there is the first banquet. Picture it. Rows of officials in silk robes, a table stretching endlessly, dishes too beautiful to touch. She sits among them, her fan resting lightly in her hand, her smile carefully maintained, but inside, her heart races like a bird in a cage. Every look from another concubine feels like an evaluation, every murmur behind her chair a coded message. She learns quickly that friendship is measured in how slowly someone offers a cup, how long they let their eyes linger, how gracefully they accept a refusal. Her youth does not protect her, it exposes her. Older consorts watch, seasoned in the art of surviving, with nothing more than a glance and a gift. They know she is new, they know she is still learning, and they will test her. In the palace, innocence is not charming, it is dangerous. At night, in her chamber, the girl writes small verses on scraps of paper, not meant for anyone else, just for herself. A way to remember the simpler mornings when she could chase dragonflies, or lean against cool stone in summer. Those verses are hidden in drawers, behind cushions, even tucked into the sleeves of robes. They are reminders that before the title, before the performance, she was simply herself. And yet, the palace does not allow much room for simply yourself. Every day brings a new lesson. She learns that medicine jars are kept separate from spice jars, and that the distance between them must be respected. But she also notices that sometimes the distances blur, that certain powders resemble one another too closely, that sometimes a gift of fruit arrives at dusk when she is not hungry, yet must still be tasted. Her eyes sharpen. She learns not to ask directly, but to observe. Who placed the tray? Who carried it? Who lingered too long? Suspicion becomes second nature, as essential as breathing. Youth fades not through years but through awareness, through the moment she realizes that even her laughter must be rationed. And you can feel the irony, can't you? Chosen for splendor, but what she truly receives is a life of constant calculation. Every gesture rehearsed, every smile weighed, every breath a potential signal. The girl who entered with dreams of blossoms now walks carefully through shadows, and the palace watches her like a mirror that never blinks. But what happens when that mirror starts reflecting not just her presence, but her absence? What will the palace say, and what will it hide, when a cup remains untouched too long, or when a curtain closes earlier than expected? Banquets and poisoned cups, those words alone could keep you awake, couldn't they? Yet in the palace, they were not thrilling dramas. They were daily tests disguised as rituals of harmony. Imagine walking into a hall where every dish gleams under candlelight, every goblet sparkles with carved jade, and yet every bite is a gamble. You can almost hear the clink of porcelain lids being lifted, the careful coughs of ministers testing the air, the steady rhythm of musicians trying to hold the silence together. The Empress sits at the center of this performance. Her robe, embroidered with phoenixes, shimmers in the lantern light. Courtiers bow deeply, presenting trays as though they were offerings to heaven. But behind the bows lurk questions. Will she drink? Will she smile? Will her hand hesitate for half a heartbeat? In those fractions of time, people build entire stories. Picture Itone jade goblet tipping, slipping to the ground. The red wine splashes across tiles like a sudden wound, though no one dares call it that. Gasps catch in throats but quickly turn into polite silence. No one moves to clean the mess right away. Why? Because they are all waiting to see what the Empress does. Does she laugh it off? A graceful nod to fate? Or does her gaze sharpen, reminding everyone that accidents in the palace are rarely just accidents? You and I know the truth. These banquets were as much about theatre as they were about food. The dishes were beautiful, yes, but they were also weapons in disguise. A soup too fragrant could raise suspicion. A fruit too perfectly timed could taste of calculation. Even the color of the wine could whisper rumors if it seemed darker than usual. Think of it like an ancient reality show, where every contestant pretends to be calm, but the real game is survival. Instead of hidden cameras, you had hundreds of watchful eyes. Instead of elimination rounds, you had sudden illnesses that scribes politely recorded as seasonal. And instead of dramatic music, you had zithers and flutes repeating the same phrase, as though begging the evening to pass without incident. The Empress herself became an expert in reading this language. She learned to set her cup down slowly enough to suggest thoughtfulness, but not so slowly as to imply doubt. She tasted just enough of each dish to show trust, but never finished anything that might betray overconfidence. Her role was not just to eat, but to teach everyone else how to interpret her eating. It was a choreography of caution, but imagine the tension pressing on her shoulders. A slip of the hand could mean suspicion, a glance at the wrong servant could condemn someone. When she raised a cup, she was not drinking wine, she was drinking risk, and everyone in the room tasted it with her. Sometimes, though, even the most careful choreography faltered. A rival might send a delicacy at dusk, accompanied by compliments too sweet. An unfamiliar maid might serve soup, her eyes lowered a second too long. And in those moments, the Empress's heartbeat was a louder sound than the entire orchestra. To accept was dangerous. To refuse was also dangerous. There was no safe choice, only the illusion of one. And you wonder how many of those illnesses recorded in chronicles began at tables like these. How many disappearances were preceded by a feast where the wrong dish was offered, or the wrong goblet tipped. History avoids the details, smoothing them into phrases like unfortunate passing. But the silence of the scribes is louder than any confession. Close your eyes and imagine it. A hall drenched in gold, laughter echoing like porcelain, yet every smile tightened by fear. You're seated there, the lanterns glowing too warmly, the wine shimmering too red. Would you dare take a sip? Or would you let the cup linger in your hand, knowing that even hesitation could become tomorrow's rumor? That is the peril of these feasts. They fed the empire, not with food, but with stories. Stories of who drank, who declined, who vanished before dawn. And behind those stories lay the quiet footsteps leading back to the Empress's chamber, where shadows grew longer, and the palace whispered of endings no one wanted to write down. But if feasts revealed danger, the harem magnified it. Smiles turned into masks, gifts into weapons, friendships into fences. And for the Empress, surviving banquets was only the beginning of surviving the theatre of women who shared her world. The harem's theatre of masks sounded like a place of music, jewels, and laughter. But for the women who lived inside, it was closer to a stage where every glance, every word, every silence was part of the script. Imagine walking into a garden where hundreds of flowers bloom, yet each one leans toward the sun not for beauty, but for survival. That was the harem. Dazzling, fragrant, but edged with quiet danger. The Empress presided as its center, her phoenix crown glittering, her robes trailing like a river of silk. On the surface, harmony reigned. Concubines strolled in pairs, sharing poems, exchanging small gifts of fans or hairpins. Musicians played softly in the background, the air perfumed with incense and blossoms. If you didn't look closer, you'd think it was simply an elegant salon. But the palace loved illusions. Under the masks, rivalries simmered hotter than any brazier. Think of it like a high school cafeteria, but with stakes 1,000 times higher. Who sits next to whom? Who shares food? Who laughs just a beat too late? All these gestures meant something. A smile wasn't always a smile, it could be a declaration of loyalty or an unspoken threat. And everyone, from the newest maid to the emperor himself, read these cues like a language. The Empress herself had to perfect this silent vocabulary. If she favored one concubine too much, others bristled. If she ignored someone entirely, rumors spread that she feared them. Balance was everything. A nod here, a compliment there, careful enough to keep harmony alive without giving anyone too much ground. It was exhausting, like spinning porcelain plates in mid-air and hoping none of them crashed. And then there were the gifts. A bolt of rare silk, a tray of candied fruits, a carved jade ornament on the surface, tokens of friendship, yet each carried layers of meaning. A gift too lavish might be seen as bribery. A gift too modest, as an insult. Some gifts even carried suspicion. A dish arriving late at night, a perfume too strong, a delicacy too perfectly chosen. You can almost feel the tension in the air, as the Empress lifted a lid, wondering if generosity was simply camouflage. Whispers thrived here. They flowed down corridors like invisible rivers. A concubine, who fainted after dinner, did she fall ill, or was she pushed? A servant who left the palace suddenly, did she marry off quietly, or did she know too much? No one ever asked directly. Instead, they repeated the rumors softly, reshaping them like clay, until no one remembered where they began. For the Empress, the harem was both her strength and her trap. It was the stage where she could show her dignity, win allies, and reinforce her authority. But it was also the arena where her enemies circled, cloaked in courtesy. Every day was a performance, her laughter rehearsed, her silences calculated, her kindness rationed. She had to be both generous and guarded, open yet untouchable. Imagine her evenings, seated in a pavilion with lanterns swaying, concubines around her reciting verses about the moon. Their voices sound delicate, but their eyes are sharp, measuring every tilt of her head. Even the servants, bowing with trays of tea, carried stories in their silence. The Empress smiled, nodded, and maintained composure about. Inside, she was translating the unspoken, catching hints in every pause. This was a theatre without curtains. Performances never ended. They simply shifted from gardens to corridors to banquet halls. And unlike a play, the stakes weren't applause, they were survival. To misread the performance was to risk everything. You might be wondering, how did she endure it? The answer lies in resilience sharpened by necessity. The Empress learned to embrace stillness, to let rivals exhaust themselves with schemes, to answer barbed gifts with grace. So smooth it left no room for accusation. But still, even the strongest masks slip at times, and when they did, the palace remembered. A single crack in composure could echo for weeks. An argument overheard, a glance held too long, a hesitation before tasting food. These small fissures were enough for others to press harder. The harem was merciless, not with swords, but with smiles that hid knives sharper than steel. It's unsettling, isn't it, that a world so beautiful could be so perilous, that a garden of blossoms could mask a battlefield, and yet, this was the daily life of the Empress, queen of masks, prisoner of performances. But if the harem was a stage, the court itself was the audience and the Empress's health. Her presence, even her silences, became scripts for ministers to read. What would happen when politics began interpreting her every breath? Politics written in shadows. When you step out of the perfumed gardens of the harem, you enter corridors lined not with blossoms, but with scrolls. The air is different here. Incense still lingers, but it mixes with the dust of bamboo slips and silk memorials, the lifeblood of the empire's bureaucracy. Ministers murmur in tones polished by ritual, eunuchs scurry like living footnotes, and behind every line of policy is a shadow cast by someone unseen. For the Empress, these shadows could be as heavy as chains. Her health, her presence, her very gestures were treated like indicators of the empire's destiny. Miss a ceremony, and whispers raced through the court before the ink on the next edict was dry. Attend a ritual with a faint pallor, and it was read as an omen of disorder. In a palace where generals planned campaigns and ministers debated taxes, the color of her cheeks could tilt the balance. Imagine it, a council chamber, where scrolls are unfurled, filled with neat columns of characters. To us, they'd look like lines on a spreadsheet. To the ministers, they were weapons, each word a potential lever to move the emperor's mind. And threaded between those words was the Empress herself, invoked in phrases like "for the harmony of the inner court" or "in respect of the sacred household." She was a living clause, cited without consent. Sometimes her silence spoke louder than anything. If she failed to comment on a gift, the giver might panic. If she praised one province's tribute too warmly, another governor might sense favoritism. The irony is that in trying to say nothing, she often said the most. Like a politician today who avoids a tweet, only for the absence itself to make headlines sure non-words were words. The ministers knew how to read illness like a weather report. A delay in rising, a faint cough, a smaller appetite at banquets. Each detail became a footnote in political debates. You can almost see them, robes rustling, eyes flicking to each other, wondering, is this the moment to propose a new alliance? To push forward a cousin's promotion? To lean into a faction that promises stability if her health falters? And what of the emperor? He was not blind, but he was surrounded. Between the Empress's chambers and the throne stretched a labyrinth of messages, interpretations, and subtle pressures. Courtiers might insist she was strong when she was not, or whisper of her fragility when she was perfectly well. The truth of her condition was filtered through layers of interest, each eager to turn her life into leverage. For the Empress, walking into these spaces meant stepping onto another stage with no music, no blossoms, no lantern-lit masks, but with stakes just as deadly. She had to control not only her words, but her very posture. Sit too straight, and she risked seeming domineering. Sit too slouched, and she risked looking weak. Even her coughs became political instruments, played and replayed in the minds of men writing edicts. You might be wondering, how could a woman maintain dignity under such scrutiny? The answer lies in her mastery of ritual. Ritual was both her shield and her script. By performing rites flawless, lighting incense at the correct moment, pouring libations with steady hand, she wrapped herself in the armor of tradition. Right, as long as she followed the choreography, interpretation had less room to twist. But of course, there was always room. Shadows always find cracks to stretch across. And here is the haunting question. How many decisions that shaped dynasties were really born from these misread signals? Did armies march because a minister thought her silence meant support? Did alliances crumble because she looked pale under lantern light? We'll never know. History records the edicts, not the glances. Yet as you walk with me deeper into this world, feel the weight pressing on her. Every breath became text, every gesture an annotation. She was no longer a woman alone. She was a symbol to be interpreted, a shadow to be shaped. And in this theatre of paper and whispers, one truth lingered. The higher she rose, the more fragile her footing became. But what happens when those fragile steps led her not to influence, but to a peak so dazzling, so blinding, that every whisper sharpened into a blade? When the Empress no longer stood in shadow, but at the very height of splendor, at the peak of splendor, the palace itself seemed to breathe in rhythm with her. Walk into the throne hall and you would feel it instantly. The hush when she entered, the sudden stillness of courtiers who dared not meet her eyes too long, the way even lantern flames seemed to steady as if bowing. She had become more than a person. She was the climate of the empire, a season that everyone lived inside. Festivals were tuned to her presence. Lanterns shone in her colors, musicians played pieces said to flatter her voice, poets embedded her name into verses that were recited in markets and temples alike. Tribute arrived from provinces, in caravans that stretched for miler silks in shades unknown elsewhere. Mirrors polished so finely they captured moods, not just faces. These gifts were not mere tokens. They were acknowledgments that her influence had seeped far beyond the walls of the harem. And yet, splendor is a precarious balance. The higher the candle, the more you notice every draught. If she smiled too warmly at one minister, another cooled. If she extended mercy to a rival, whispers spread that she was weakening. If she scolded too sharply, others muttered of tyranny. In this rarefied air, every decision was magnified until it could either stabilize or shatter the delicate harmony. Think of it as standing at the top of a mountain, with an incredible view, but also realizing there is no rail, no barrier, only the vast drop beneath. Everyone looks up at you, admires the position, envies the scenery. But you are the one who feels the wind most sharply, the one who knows that one wrong step could mean a fall no one will forget. The Empress had mastered ritual, learned silence, perfected the art of balancing gifts and glances. At this summit, she needed new skills, the ability to project serenity while hiding exhaustion, to remain generous without seeming indulgent, to shape her image as both untouchable and humane. A paradox, but one she embodied daily. And still, loneliness slipped in like water under doors. Surrounded by attendants, bathed in light, she could not confide in anyone. Every word might travel, every gesture might be repeated, twisted. Even the emperor, her partner in theory, was also a figure whose gaze measured as much as it embraced. In the deep of night, with only a fading candle for company, she may have wondered whether she was truly seen or only watched. The harem mirrored this duality. Concubines bowed lower, their laughter softer, their gifts more carefully chosen. But beneath, calculation never slept. Some sought to flatter her in hopes of protection. Others smiled with sharpened patience, waiting for the day the phoenix crown would weigh too heavily. The Empress, radiant as she was, knew the petals around her were edged in thorns. Yet she shone. Processions carried her image through city streets, crowds pressing to catch a glimpse, believing her presence alone a blessing. Children learned songs that compared her grace to the moon, steady and eternal. In those moments, she seemed beyond danger, almost divine. But we know, and perhaps she knew, that the brighter the light, the darker the shadow it casts. Because splendor is not safety. In fact, it invites scrutiny sharper than any blade. Rivals hidden in plain sight, ministers eager to twist gestures into omens, servants carrying trays with trembling handsaw were part of her peak. Her crown glittered, but it was also a target. And so we ask ourselves, what happens when this carefully balanced brilliance begins to flicker? When the cough no one wants to hear escapes her lips? When her absence from a single ritual is noted in too many whispers? The palace adored her splendor, yes, but it was already preparing its next act. Because after the summit, there is only one path left. The slow, inevitable descent. Decline heard in whispers if splendor made her glow like a lantern. Decline dimmed that light, and the palace noticed instantly. It always did. One cough, one day of rest, one slightly shorter procession, and suddenly, the air thickened. Courtiers who once bowed with unshakable smiles now exchanged glances. Eunuchs stepped more carefully, attendants bowed longer, and even the rhythm of the drums at night seemed slower, as though echoing the change. The palace, after all, was an empire of interpretation. Ministers treated her health as if it were an oracle. If she skipped a banquet, it wasn't simply fatigue, it was a sign. If her voice faltered during a ritual chant, scribes noted it with invisible ink in their minds, ready to read it as an omen of disorder. A pallor in her face could become the argument for a new alliance, or the pretext for rivals to whisper of succession. And the whispers did grow. Not loud, never loud. Rumors in the palace travelled like smoke, curling around corners, slipping under doors. A concubine mentions that the Empress has lost her appetite. A maid repeats that she heard soft coughing in the night. By morning, these tiny details bloom into stories. She is gravely ill. She is being poisoned. She is fading by design. Outside the palace walls, the people created their own verses. Ballads sung in the markets painted her as a tragic figure, undone by jealousy. In temples, incense smoke carried prayers for her recovery, mixed with superstitions about imperial fate. Children learned rhymes that hinted at an empress who vanished through hidden doors or slipped away into moonlight. These weren't just fancies, they were the way ordinary people explained the silence of official records. Inside, courtiers adjusted their steps. Some distanced themselves discreetly, unwilling to be tied to her potential fall. Others leaned closer, hoping to squeeze a final blessing or seal of favor before the end. Allies became tentative, rivals became bold, and in this fragile season, the Empress's every movement carried exaggerated weight. Sitting upright for too long proved she was still strong. Missing one ritual confirmed all suspicions. Imagine her chamber during this time. Curtains drawn, bronze brazier glowing faintly, attendants hovering but afraid to speak. She sips a bowl of medicine, its steam rising like a veil between her and the world. Her eyes, once bright with command, now heavy with the awareness that every swallow, every breath, is being interpreted far beyond these walls. Even the emperor perhaps caring, perhaps calculating, watches with a gaze she cannot fully trust. Decline did not arrive as thunder. It crept like mist. And mist is hard to grasp. Was she truly ill, or merely exhausted by the performance of power? Was there poison in her cup, or only fear in her mind? History shrugs, offering us phrases like seasonal sickness or unfortunate exhaustion, as though centuries of silence could be tidied away in a footnote. But you and I hear the echoes differently. We sense the loneliness of a woman who once commanded festivals, now uncertain of who would rejoice at her recovery, and who might secretly pray for her absence. We hear the faint cough amplified by marble walls into something larger than life. We watch as attendants light extra lanterns, not for brightness, but to comfort themselves against the encroaching shadow. And then one night, the hush grows heavier. No music drifts from the gardens, no laughter from concubines. A tray is delivered late, but no one dares taste it. A curtain remains drawn, even as dawn rises. The palace holds its breath. By the time the drums sound, they beat slower, deeper, mourning a truth that no one will write directly. The chronicles will record it politely. The Empress passed after sudden illness, but the whispers will never end. Did she fall to poison, to neglect, to politics? Or did she simply slip into silence, the way mist vanishes at sunrise? And so decline ends, not with clarity, but with mystery. And in mystery, legacy begins. Legacy in smoke and ink. When an empress vanishes, the palace does not mourn as others do. It edits. The first drafts of her legacy are written not in tears, but in scrolls and ceremonies. Officials bow before ancestral tablets, scribes dip brushes into ink, and with a few neat phrases, they transform a life of fear, splendor, whispers, and decline into a tidy line. She was devoted. She passed peacefully. The messier truths, of course, are folded away, but silence is never perfect. You and I can still hear the seams splitting. In the villages, storytellers spin other endings. One tale says she was poisoned at a banquet, betrayed by a rival's smile. Another says she disappeared into a hidden passage, living the rest of her days as a nameless monk. Children sing rhymes about an empress who became the moon, watching silently as the empire shifted without her. In these stories, the palace's version competes with the people's imagination and often loses. Inside the palace, her absence rearranges everything. Chambers are reassigned. A portrait draped in white silk is moved to a quieter hall. New favorites rise in the harem, careful to learn from her mistakes, eager not to repeat her fate. Ministers cite her memory in arguments that have little to do with her, bending her name into a tool Her legacy becomes a chess piece, shifted back and forth until no one remembers the real woman who once sat at the board. And yet, fragments resist erasure. A jade hairpin left in a drawer, a robe that should have been burned, but instead was folded into a chest, a physician's record with one page missing. These quiet survivors whisper of an unfinished story, daring future generations to wonder what really happened. History likes certainty, but it has always been terrible at hiding its gaps. Think of it as the empire's way of leaving breadcrumbs. Official chronicles offer the polished, dignified version. Rumors preserve the dangerous, scandalous one. Artifacts hide in between, hinting at something stranger still. Was she truly gone? Or did she remain in the palace's DNA, shaping every woman who came after? Every new empress had to live with the shadow of those who passed peacefully, even if no one believed it. For the people, she became a symbol. In festivals, her name was whispered into lantern smoke. In temples, women prayed to her spirit for protection against jealous rivals. In markets, her story was sung to warn daughters that beauty and power walk hand in hand with peril. In this way, she lived on not as a single truth, but as a constellation of truths, each glowing faintly, each refusing to vanish. And that, perhaps, is her most lasting gift. Not certainty, but curiosity. Not closure, but questions. She teaches us that even the most carefully written chronicles are only drafts, and that silence often speaks louder than proclamations. When we remember her, we don't recite dates, we lean closer, listening for the rustle of silk, the faint clink of a goblet, the sigh of a curtain closing too soon. Her legacy is this: a reminder that power is fragile, memory is flexible, and stories, especially bedtime stories like this, wonder how we stitch together the fragments left behind. She may be gone, but she is not forgotten. She lingers in every rumor, every whispered suspicion, every lantern that flickers when the night is too still. And as we leave these palace halls behind, the smoke thins, the ink dries, and yet the questions remain. Did she die of poison, or exhaustion, or politics? Or is she still here, watching through the cracks, reminding us that history is always less certain than it claims? We've walked together through silence and whispers, through banquet halls bright with lanterns and corridors heavy with smoke. We've seen how a girl could step into the palace carrying her family's hopes, only to find herself wearing a crown heavier than stone. We followed her into the theatre of smiles, into banquets where cups trembled, into rituals where her very breath became a line of text for ministers to interpret. We stood with her at the summit of splendor, where she seemed untouchable, and then we lingered as her light dimmed, hearing decline in the faint coughs the palace chose not to record. Now, as we close this journey, let's let the noise fall away. Picture again the lanterns from our open their small circles of gold hovering in the dark. They are still here, patient, reminding us that even in endings, some light remains. The palace is far behind us now. The silk curtains and vermilion walls fade into memory. All that is left is the hush, gentle and steady, the kind of quiet that doesn't demand answers but invites rest. So, breathe with me. In, slow and calm. Out, even slower. Let the stories settle, like dust on lacquer, like ink on paper. They'll wait for you. History is never in a hurry. And if tonight you find yourself drifting into sleep, may the whispers of vanished empresses keep you company only as gentle dreams, not as burdens. Because when you think of power, you might imagine fear or perhaps silence. And silence, in its softest form, is what carries us now.